The summer light over Normandy felt strangely thin, filtered through drifting smoke that carried the weight of thousands of unspoken fears. And as the days lengthened in June of 1944, the war breathed with a new and ragged rhythm. Among the hedgerows, where shadows clung like desperate fingers to every fold of the earth, men fought and bled under a command structure stretched tight by ambition, pride, and the unbearable burden of expectation. Far behind the lines in a commandeered chateau whose walls still smelled of centuries-old damp stone, Winston Churchill sat heavy in his chair, listening as reports arrived like slow, painful heartbeats. Montgomery, his brilliant, stubborn field marshal, had once again strayed beyond Eisenhower's directives, shaping the battle according to his own fiercely held vision. The Supreme Commander's orders had called for coordinated pressure, a rhythm of advances interlocked like gears in a great machine. But Montgomery's interpretation, cool and resolute, diverged into a plan framed by his unwavering belief that only he understood the fragile pulse of Normandy's bottlenecks. And so Churchill listened, cigar unmoving between his fingers, as the consequences began to ripple outward. Outside, a late afternoon wind rattled the window frames, the Normandy air carrying the scent of churned soil and distant cordite. Churchill's advisers watched the Prime Minister's expression as though reading a shifting weather map. He had defended Montgomery before Parliament, before Roosevelt, before the world. He had crafted him into a symbol of British resolve. Yet now, the tension between Montgomery and Eisenhower threatened to widen into a fracture at the heart of the Allied command. Eisenhower, steady as an oak set deep in American earth, had sent word with measured firmness that the plan must be followed. That deviation risked not merely strategic confusion, but the lives of countless soldiers waiting for cohesion to guide them through the blood and tangled fields. Churchill leaned back, and for a moment the room felt small around him, thick with the ghosts of Gallipoli and every military debate that had left its scars on his conscience. He knew Montgomery's temperament, knew the man's unshakable confidence, knew the pride that lived like an ember just beneath the uniform. And yet, Churchill also knew Eisenhower's burden, the quiet resolve behind the American commander's smile, the almost painful diplomacy with which he held together armies, egos, and nations. These men were not merely leaders. They were pillars upon which the fragile hope of Europe rested. To see them in conflict was to feel the war itself groan under the weight. A messenger entered, boots leaving faint marks on the worn rug, and offered a fresh report. Montgomery's units were advancing with intensity, pushing where Eisenhower had not intended pressure to be applied, raising questions that would reach headquarters before the sun dipped behind the smoke. Churchill took the paper, eyes narrowing not in anger, but in contemplation. In that moment, he felt a flicker of the old impatience, that desperate desire to shape events with the sheer force of his own conviction. But this was Eisenhower's theatre. Churchill had promised himself he would not meddle. That victory required trust in the men entrusted with command. Still, the question of what to say, what to advise, what tone to strike when two titans pulled in different directions, weighed heavy on him. He rose slowly and walked to the window, looking out toward the west, where the sky glowed pale and wounded. He thought of the young soldiers crouched in trenches that smelled of mud and death, men who did not know of Montgomery's decisions or Eisenhower's frustrations, but who would feel their consequences in the fire of battle. Leadership, Churchill knew, was not the thunderous declaration of certainty that people imagined. It was the quiet agony of knowing that every word carried the weight of a generation's fate. He closed his eyes, gathering thoughts that swirled like ash. When he finally spoke to his advisers, his voice was low, almost tender beneath its gravel. He reminded them that Monty was a man of method and brilliance, but also a man who needed guidance, not confrontation. He said Eisenhower must be supported, for the unity of command was the spine of victory. And then, with a sigh that seemed to drain years from his lungs, he murmured the words that would later echo in the corridors of both British and American command. "You must understand, gentlemen, Ike is the captain of this ship. If Monty forgets it, then someone must remind him, not with fury, but with the firmness of a friend who sees the storm ahead more clearly than he does. It was not a rebuke, not entirely. Instead, it was the delicate stitching together of two clashing wills, an attempt to bind pride to purpose before the battlefield's chaos widened the rift. The room fell still, as if Normandy itself were listening. Churchill turned away from the window, shoulders squared, the weight of history pressing into his bones. Outside, the last rays of daylight bled into the drifting smoke, as if the sky were absorbing the story before it fully unfolded. And somewhere in the tangled fields beyond, Montgomery continued his advance, steadfast in his own vision, unaware that Churchill's words were already beginning their journey toward him. Words meant not to crush, but to guide, spoken by a man who understood that even the greatest commanders sometimes needed reminding that victory was a shared, fragile endeavour. Dawn came to Normandy as a pale bruise across the horizon, soft light bleeding into smoke and drizzle. The muted hum of war awakening once more beneath a sky that had forgotten silence. Eisenhower's headquarters near Granville was already stirring, the corridors filled with the dry rustle of papers, the scratch of telephones, and the tired faces of men who lived by maps more than by sleep. The Supreme Commander, dressed in his immaculate khaki, stood before a great wall of shifting lines and symbols. He stared long enough for the room to sense the quiet pulse of his frustration. Montgomery's movements had gone beyond the coordinated design. Again. His insistence on securing Caen at all costs, his refusal to accelerate in step with American advances, had strained the symmetry Eisenhower needed to press forward toward Paris. Yet Eisenhower did not curse nor shout. He merely inhaled deeply, the breath of a man carrying the full weight of Allied unity on his shoulders. He called for his liaison officers, his voice level but edged with fatigue. His words were simple: "Find me clarity." What he meant was far more complex. The balance between maintaining harmony and enforcing authority was a knife's edge. He knew Monty, respected him, even liked him. But he also knew that the British Field Marshal's conviction bordered on obstinacy. The war had created men like Montgomery, men who needed control as others needed air. Eisenhower could not simply reprimand him. To do so would fracture morale, stir resentments already simmering in the British press, and risk the precious illusion that every Allied stride was made in perfect step. As the day thickened into movement, messages began to flow back from the front. Montgomery was consolidating rather than pushing, claiming patience, caution, the need to preserve his strength. The Americans under Bradley, however, felt the tension like a physical wound. Their forces were pressing through the hedgerows with ferocity, losing men at a rate that gnawed at discipline, while the British advance lagged behind expectations. Eisenhower, hearing this, pressed his thumb to the bridge of his nose. It was not the tactics alone that troubled him. It was the narrative forming in the minds of men. Every soldier, every correspondent, every general carried their own version of what was happening, and in war, perception could rot cohesion faster than bullets. That afternoon, as a fine rain began to fall over the fields of Normandy, Churchill's words reached Eisenhower through his liaison channel. It was not an official directive, not even a letter marked with urgency, just a quiet, personal message. Monty must be handled as one tends to a fire, not smothered, but watched. His flame will burn brightest if given purpose, not reprimand. Eisenhower read it twice. The Prime Minister's tone was paternal, cautious, perhaps even protective. Churchill wanted harmony, but he wanted victory more, and he understood that to alienate Montgomery might risk both. Eisenhower sighed, folding the message neatly. His reply, though respectful, carried a steel beneath its courtesy. "I appreciate Mr. Churchill's counsel, but if this fire consumes the structure we've built, it will not matter how bright it burns." By evening, reports from the front grew darker. The British lines were stalled under heavy resistance outside Caen, while American units, under Patton's restless energy, were ready to burst through in the south. Tension crept into briefings like smoke under a door. Officers avoided eye contact, aware that every opinion might become political ammunition. War was no longer just fought with guns. It was fought with pride, correspondence, and the subtle diplomacy of survival. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, muttered that the supreme commander was being tested, that Montgomery's defiance was not just tactical, but personal. Eisenhower dismissed the idea aloud, though privately he could not fully disagree. Far across the Channel, Churchill read the same reports with a kind of mournful patience. He was back in London now, pacing his war rooms beneath Whitehall, the electric hum of the map lights reflecting in his tired eyes. He could feel the tremors of conflict within his alliance, small cracks in the vast machinery that he had helped build. For all his bulldog defiance in public, he knew diplomacy was the only weapon left to wield between such colossal egos. In private conversation with his aides, he spoke carefully, measuring every phrase. Eisenhower holds the reins, but Monty rides with a mind of his own. One must not let the horse throw the carriage. Later that night, Churchill summoned his military secretary and dictated a note, not to be sent to Montgomery directly, but through the most discreet of channels. It was neither an order nor a rebuke. It was, rather, a reminder dressed as encouragement. Remember always that victory lies not in brilliance alone, but in obedience to the harmony of command. Eisenhower's word is law. Serve him, and history will serve you. The message, softened by Churchill's eloquence, carried across the Channel like a whisper in the dark. Whether Montgomery would hear its true meaning was another matter. And so the days moved on, the front lines creeping, the air filled with the mingled scent of courage and doubt. The men in the fields continued to fight without ever knowing the debates unfolding above them. They simply advanced, bled, and died beneath orders whose origins they could never comprehend. Yet in London, in Granville, and along the beaches where command posts pulsed like nervous hearts, the invisible battle between authority and pride raged on. A quieter war, but one just as perilous to the cause of freedom. If you've reached this far, tell me, from which part of the world are you following this story? I'd love to know where our audience of history and courage is watching from. The third week of the Normandy campaign began beneath low clouds that carried the smell of rain and burnt metal, drifting inland from the Channel like a tired sigh. The land was still swollen from shell fire, villages reduced to skeletons of stone and dust. In this wounded landscape, the tension between Montgomery and Eisenhower had begun to seep like oil through the ranks of command. The British and American staffs exchanged polite smiles over breakfast tables while drafting reports that bristled with veiled accusations. Each side defended its hero with a kind of weary pride, as though the war itself were a contest of tempers rather than the liberation of Europe. Churchill, from his underground rooms in London, watched the storm brewing and knew that a word spoken too harshly, a letter phrased too bluntly, could unravel months of fragile cooperation. In Caen, Montgomery's headquarters thrummed with confidence that bordered on defiance. Maps hung from every wall, their corners curling from the damp. Monty himself paced before them, pointer in hand, tapping at the lines of advance as his officers murmured agreement. His logic was as sharp as his temper. The British army, he insisted, was fixing the Germans in place, absorbing their fury so that the Americans could break through elsewhere. It was not delay, it was design. When a staff officer mentioned Eisenhower's concern, Montgomery's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. "Ike worries too much," he said quietly. "He commands from the clouds, and I from the mud." The words were not meant to wound, but they travelled fast, carried on whispers to Allied ears that were already listening too intently for insult. By contrast, Eisenhower's manner was calm, almost paternal. He received Montgomery's justifications with the patience of a man who understood that anger would serve no purpose. Yet, in private moments, that patience thinned. He confided to his aide that unity was harder than battle, that diplomacy among allies demanded more courage than any beach landing. "We are all prisoners of our victories," he said one night, his voice low. "Monty cannot forget El Alamein. He believes he's been chosen by history itself. Eisenhower had no wish to humiliate him. The success of Overlord depended on cooperation. But he also knew that the British public adored Montgomery with a fervour bordering on worship. To confront him openly would risk dividing two nations at the very moment their sons fought side by side. Churchill's anxiety deepened with each communiqué. His instinct was to intervene, to write letters that crackled with his trademark fire. Yet he restrained himself. He remembered too well the ghosts of past campaigns where politics had poisoned command. Still, he could not remain silent. On the evening of 2nd July, he met with his chiefs of staff in the map room. The air was thick with smoke and the low hum of wireless transmissions. He listened as Alan Brooke, his stern and loyal chief of the Imperial General Staff, read out Eisenhower's latest message, courteous but pointed, a reminder that the Allied plan required synchronization, not improvisation. Churchill's fingers tightened on his cigar. Monty must realize, Brooke said, that this is not Africa. He commands not alone, but within an orchestra. Churchill exhaled, a slow cloud of smoke. And yet, Alan, an orchestra needs more than one instrument of courage. Monty's tune may jar, but it has rhythm enough to rouse an army. He paused, eyes glinting beneath the lamplight. Still, we cannot have discord when the world listens for harmony. He dictated a message for transmission to Eisenhower, couched in language that carried both admiration and warning. Your leadership unites continents, and we trust your judgment implicitly. Yet I urge patience with our dear Monty, whose zeal is both his virtue and his curse. Guide him firmly, but never publicly. His pride, once wounded, becomes unmanageable. The cause must come before character. Eisenhower, reading that note the next morning, smiled faintly, the smile of a man too tired to resent advice. He replied simply, "Understood. My aim is victory, not vanity." Meanwhile, Montgomery prepared a press conference at his headquarters. His staff advised caution, but Monty brushed it aside. The correspondents adored him, his clipped tone, his confidence, his refusal to flatter. Before a gathering of weary war reporters, he outlined his version of events, explaining that his forces had met fierce resistance by design, pinning the enemy so others might strike. "We are the anvil," he declared, "upon which victory will be hammered." It was brilliant theatre, a masterstroke of morale. And yet to Eisenhower, it sounded like justification wrapped in glory. The American press, reading between the lines, suggested that Montgomery was claiming sole credit for the Allied effort. The tension hardened into something perilous. That evening, as thunder rolled over the beaches, Churchill received a private cable from Eisenhower. It was brief, almost pleading in tone. "Request your counsel. Unity fraying. Need reassurance London supports chain of command." The Prime Minister sat for a long while before replying. His secretary later recalled that Churchill's face was carved with fatigue, the face of a man at war with his own loyalties. He finally dictated, "Eisenhower commands by right and by destiny. Britain stands behind him. I shall remind Montgomery that the light of victory shines brightest when shared." And he did. The message was delivered discreetly to Monty's quarters that same night. Accounts vary on how he received it. Some say he read it in silence, folding it carefully before turning back to his maps. Others claim he smiled wryly and said, "Winston means well, but I have no intention of changing the plan." Whatever his reaction, the seed had been planted. The British press soon carried word that Churchill and Eisenhower were united in purpose, and Montgomery's tone softened, just enough to ease the growing strain. Yet the war did not pause for egos. The guns thundered across the bocage, and the men in the mud knew nothing of the letters that crossed the channel above their heads. They knew only the next hedge, the next burst of machine gun fire, the next friend to fall beside them. Leadership, Churchill mused in those long July nights, was not command at all, but the art of bearing solitude, the endless, sleepless solitude of responsibility. Night over Normandy came like a curtain of ash, heavy and slow, swallowing what daylight had failed to redeem. The guns along the Caen front murmured like a restless sea, flashes lighting the horizon with a strange, ghostly rhythm. It was July 9th, 1944, and the world's greatest alliance balanced on the thinnest thread of understanding. In London, Churchill could not sleep. He paced the narrow floor of his underground chamber, slippered feet whispering over cold stone, cigar glowing like a coal of thought. Reports from Normandy were better. Caen was finally within grasp. But the personal cables told another story. Eisenhower's patience was eroding, Montgomery's pride hardening. Churchill knew too well that wars could survive blood, but not the corrosion of distrust. He stood before the Great Wall map, its veins of red and blue lines glimmering under the low bulbs. To him, every arrow was not a movement of troops, but a wound in time, each decision a question of how history would remember courage or folly. He thought of the years he had spent rallying his people, of his promise to Roosevelt that Britain would fight until the darkness itself grew weary. But he also thought of his generals, men like Montgomery, carved from the old granite of empire, whose brilliance was always accompanied by a stubborn loneliness. Churchill understood that loneliness better than anyone. Command, after all, was a kind of exile. As the rain whispered over Whitehall, Churchill decided the moment had come to act not as Prime Minister, but as the old soldier he had once been. He drafted a private message for Montgomery, not through official channels, not dressed in diplomatic silk, but in his own unmistakable voice. The words were blunt, almost fatherly. "My dear Monty, the fruits of victory are not for the solitary tree but for the forest. Ike carries burdens you do not see. Your brilliance must not become a shadow upon his light. Let the world see in you not defiance but discipline. Remember always that the lion and the eagle must hunt together." He signed it simply W and handed it to his aide. "It must reach him quietly, without the press's nose in it," he said. The aide nodded, sensing that this was not merely a message. It was a warning, disguised as affection. In Normandy, the message reached Montgomery 2 days later. He read it under a pale dawn light, the tent walls quivering with the wind. For a long time, he said nothing. His staff watched him carefully, unsure if he would rage or reflect. But Montgomery only smiled faintly, folded the paper, and placed it in his pocket. "Winston understands half of me," he said at last. "The half that wants harmony, but the other half, that half belongs to the battlefield." Then he turned back to his maps. Yet something shifted in him after that day. His briefings grew less combative, his tone toward Eisenhower's directives more tempered. Perhaps it was Churchill's words that softened the edges, or perhaps Montgomery had simply realized that victory demanded humility as much as genius. When he next met with Eisenhower near Bayeux, the atmosphere, though cool, carried the faint scent of reconciliation. They stood together over a vast table of maps, rain tapping at the tent roof. Eisenhower spoke first. "We've both been under fire lately," he said with a weary smile. "Maybe we should give the enemy that privilege instead." Montgomery chuckled, a sound like dry gravel. "Quite so, Ike. I've no quarrel with success. It was not friendship, but it was peace. Fragile, functional, and sufficient for the task at hand." Churchill, receiving word of their meeting, felt a measure of relief bloom through his fatigue. He wrote to Roosevelt that night, describing it as a small miracle wrought not by the sword, but by the cigarette lighter. He knew, though, that the truce between personalities could only hold if the campaign advanced, and advance it did. Operation Goodwood, Montgomery's great armoured thrust toward Caen, began to take shape under the veil of reconciliation. But fate, as ever, had its own rhythm. On the morning of July 18th, the ground trembled under the roar of 1,000 British bombers as Goodwood began. The earth convulsed with thunder. Tanks rolled through fire, and Churchill watched from London with breath held. Yet the offensive stalled under fierce German resistance. The fields became graveyards of steel, Reports painted a picture of progress that was more illusion than truth. Eisenhower, studying the casualty lists, wondered whether Montgomery's caution had returned too soon, or whether his plan had been doomed from the start. In the midst of this, Churchill received another letter, this one from an American correspondent stationed near the front. It was raw, unfiltered, describing the confusion among troops about their commander's intentions. "We fight for the same flag of freedom," it read, "but sometimes it feels like two winds blowing against each other." The words cut deeply. Churchill set the paper down and stared into the dim light, realizing that the rift, though bridged in form, still haunted the heart of the Allied army. That evening he dined alone, his plate untouched. "To win a war," he muttered to the silence, "one must first win the peace among those who lead it." He raised his glass of watered brandy toward the darkness, as if toasting the invisible men who carried his hopes across the sea. The American general burdened by unity, the British field marshal shackled by pride, and the millions of unnamed souls who fought under their banners. Outside, the rain eased, and for a moment the city above seemed to breathe again. Churchill leaned back, letting his eyes close. "If we prevail," he whispered, "let it not be said we won by power alone, but by the frail thread of understanding." And somewhere beyond the Channel, under the smoke of Caen, Montgomery's men pushed once more through the wreckage of their own conviction, carrying not just rifles and rations, but the heavy silence of leaders learning to trust each other in the dying light of a continent reborn. If you've stayed with the story this far, thank you. Take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps these echoes of history reach more hearts that still beat for courage. By late July 1944, the wind over Normandy had changed. The skies were clearer, the days longer, and the sound of thunder more often came from artillery than the clouds. The land itself seemed to exhale after weeks of suffocating battle. Yet beneath the calm surface of progress, tension still lingered. A quiet war of letters and loyalties, of tempers concealed behind polished salutes. Churchill could feel it across the Channel as keenly as if the air itself carried the vibration of unease. Victory was coming closer, but so too was the moment when men's egos would demand their share of it. Montgomery's Operation Goodwood had failed to achieve the grand breakthrough he had promised. The British losses had been heavy, and the German lines, though battered, still held strong around Caen. In the south, the Americans were preparing for Operation Cobra, a daring assault that would soon rip open the front and send Patton's Third Army surging into the heart of France. Eisenhower had given the order personally, his tone clipped and calm. He trusted Bradley and Patton implicitly, but he also knew the eyes of London were fixed on the balance of glory. If Cobra succeeded where Goodwood had stumbled, the scales of prestige within the alliance would tilt dangerously. Churchill sensed it before the newspapers could even whisper. He had always known that victory was a beast fed not only by courage, but by vanity, and he feared that if the Americans triumphed too swiftly, the British morale, already frayed by years of sacrifice, would wither. In a letter to his chief of staff, he wrote, "Our friends across the ocean may win the day, but we must ensure that the history of this struggle belongs to us all. The unity of the English-speaking peoples must survive triumph as much as it has survived trial." He travelled to Portsmouth to meet with his commanders before crossing again to Normandy. The journey itself felt symbolic, a return to the soil of Europe, to the theatre of redemption. On the crossing, Churchill stood alone on deck, cap pulled low, coat flapping in the wind. The sea stretched grey and infinite, dotted with ships that bore supplies, men, and the weary spirit of hope. He thought of the invasion as a cathedral built by many hands, each brick a soldier's life. And he wondered whether its architects, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, Patton, could ever truly share the altar of victory without jealousy defiling it. When he arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters, the American general greeted him with that steady, unshakable warmth that had made him beloved of both armies. But beneath the smiles, Churchill saw exhaustion etched deep into Eisenhower's eyes. They spoke privately for over an hour, maps and coffee between them. Eisenhower's words were careful but unflinching. "Montgomery," he said, "is a great soldier, but he does not see the whole field. His caution could cost us momentum, and if he continues to treat my directives as suggestions rather than orders, he risks something greater than defeat. He risks division." Churchill listened, hands folded, eyes half closed. "You are right, Ike," he said softly. "Monty has the mind of a chess player but the heart of a crusader. He fights not only the enemy but his own conviction that he alone sees the path. Yet you must not crush him. His pride is a fortress, and when cornered, even the fortress burns." Eisenhower leaned forward. "I don't want to crush him, Winston. I want him to remember that this isn't his war. It's the world's." That night, as the distant thunder of Operation Cobra began to roll, Churchill met Montgomery once more in a small farmhouse lit by flickering candles. The two men sat opposite each other, the table between them scattered with maps, reports, and a bottle of brandy neither had touched. Outside, the rain began to fall again, thin and persistent. "Monty," Churchill began, his voice low, almost weary. "Eisenhower bears more than you can imagine. The unity of command is a thing as delicate as glass, and I cannot let it shatter. Not now. Not when we stand on the threshold of deliverance." Montgomery's gaze was cold but not unkind. "I understand the need for unity, sir, but not at the cost of method. Ike trusts fortune too much. I trust only preparation." "Fortune," Churchill said with a faint smile, "has a habit of favouring those who obey orders." There was silence then, broken only by the rain on the windows. For a moment, the two men looked not like Prime Minister and Field Marshal, but like weary pilgrims who had walked too far and forgotten the road home. Finally, Churchill stood, his shadow tall against the candlelight. "History will not remember who argued best," he said quietly, "only who prevailed. And to prevail, my dear Monty, one must sometimes yield." Montgomery said nothing. He simply nodded once, curt and precise, as if conceding not to Churchill, but to inevitability itself. When Churchill left the farmhouse, he looked out toward the dark horizon where the guns of Cobra roared. In his mind, he heard the voices of all the young men buried beneath that same earth, boys who had never cared whose plan had won, only that the war would end. He realized then that leadership was not glory, nor command, nor genius. It was endurance, the endurance to keep the alliance alive through doubt, envy, and exhaustion until the dawn finally broke. 2 days later, Cobra succeeded. The American lines burst open, the Germans reeled, and the tide of war began to turn irreversibly. Eisenhower's name was cheered across the camps, while Montgomery's tone grew quieter, his messages more measured. Churchill, reading the reports, felt both pride and melancholy. He wrote in his diary that night, "Victory is a shared child, but its parentage will always be contested." He closed the book, set down his pen, and whispered to the empty room, "Let it not be pride that ruins what courage has built." If the spirit of these words moves you, take a moment to share this story. Every new voice helps history breathe again. August 1944 arrived not as a sunrise, but as a detonation of deliverance. The hedgerows of Normandy, once the graveyard of patience, gave way to open plains, and the Allied armies began to move with the terrible beauty of an unstoppable tide. Dust rose from the columns of tanks like incense from an altar. The roads toward Paris throbbed with momentum, engines growling, flags whipping in the wind, the smell of liberation thick in the air. It was the month the war began to look winnable. And yet, for Churchill, victory brought no peace. From his train car headquarters, he watched the reports pour in. Patton driving east with reckless splendor, Bradley's men cutting the German arteries with surgical precision, Montgomery pushing north with measured inevitability. The front was expanding faster than anyone had imagined. Every general wanted to be the one whose signature crowned the liberation of Paris. Every photograph, every communiqué, every radio broadcast hinted at the question no one dared to ask aloud: who would history remember? Eisenhower stood at the center of it all, calm, disciplined, a conductor guiding an orchestra that sometimes refused to read the same sheet of music. He had long ago learned that leadership meant being the gravity that held the system together while others burned with the need to shine. Yet even he could feel the tremors of vanity shaking the unity of command. Montgomery's letters were still courteous, but the undercurrent of competition remained. He spoke of prudence, of precision, of avoiding overreach, but beneath his words, Eisenhower heard the echo of challenge. Churchill travelled again to France in mid-August, determined to see the battlefield with his own eyes. He arrived at Montgomery's headquarters near Falaise, where the air smelled of oil, sweat, and scorched wheat. The great encirclement of German forces, the Falaise pocket, was underway, and Montgomery's troops were closing the trap with the cold resolve of hunters who had waited too long for the kill. The ground was thick with corpses and twisted metal. Churchill stepped carefully through the mud, his cane sinking into the blood-soaked soil. When he met Montgomery, the field marshal was radiant with purpose, his voice crisp and alive. "We've got them, sir," he said. "This is the end of the German army in France." Churchill smiled faintly. "And may it be the beginning of Europe's resurrection." They spoke of strategy, of lines of pursuit, of the coordination with the Americans advancing from the south. Yet between their words, there was something else, a tension unspoken but understood. Montgomery sought validation. Churchill sought harmony. The Prime Minister praised him publicly, called him the architect of the enemy's ruin, but privately he wrote in his notes that Monty's pride glitters brighter than his stars. Still, Churchill could not bring himself to chastise him. For all his exasperation, he admired the man's clarity, his relentless discipline, his belief that victory was a duty, not a spectacle. Later that evening, Churchill crossed to Eisenhower's temporary headquarters. The contrast between the two men struck him like a chord of irony. Montgomery's world was order and hierarchy, while Eisenhower's was humility and persuasion. Ike welcomed him warmly, offering coffee and a chair. The conversation drifted to the liberation of Paris, de Gaulle's role, the risk of chaos, the weight of symbolism. Eisenhower spoke slowly, carefully. "The French will want their city free, and they'll want to free it themselves. I'll give them that, but I'll not let this victory become theatre." Churchill regarded him for a long moment. "My dear Eisenhower," he said, "history is always theatre. The question is, who writes the playbill?" Eisenhower smiled. "Then let's make sure the curtain falls on peace, not pride." Churchill raised his glass to that, a toast to sanity in an age that had forgotten it. He left the meeting with a strange sense of calm. Perhaps, he thought, leadership was not a contest of will, but of restraint. To command men like Montgomery and Patton and still keep the alliance whole was an achievement greater than any battlefield triumph. As the days passed, the encirclement at Falaise tightened. The German army collapsed, leaving its armour smoking and broken across the French countryside. The Allied advance gathered speed, a river of steel flowing toward Paris. Churchill received the news of the city's liberation on the morning of August 25th. Bells rang across London, crowds filled Trafalgar Square, and for a brief, blinding moment, the war seemed to fade beneath the light of victory. Yet even in celebration, Churchill's heart remained restless. He knew that triumph was fragile, that once the guns fell silent, the old tensions would resurface. Between nations, between generals, between memory and truth. Standing before his staff, cigar smouldering, he said softly, "The hardest part is not winning the war, but surviving the peace it brings." That night, as the crowd sang in the streets above his underground office, Churchill sat alone at his desk. He wrote in his diary, "Montgomery fought with brilliance, Eisenhower with grace. Between them, they have delivered Europe from bondage. May they never forget that it was not ambition that won the day, but endurance." He closed the book, extinguished his cigar, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The lion and the eagle had indeed hunted together, and though they had clawed and growled, their prey now lay vanquished. The victory was theirs, but the peace was yet to be earned. If this story speaks to you, take a moment to share or subscribe. It keeps the echoes of courage alive for those who still listen to history's heartbeat. Autumn crept upon Europe like a sigh of relief wrapped in mourning. The fields that had burned in July now lay quiet beneath the pale gold of September light. Normandy's villages stirred again with life. Children playing among ruins, farmers returning to the soil, church bells trembling in towers where smoke had once risen. The guns had not yet fallen silent across the continent, but the tide had turned so completely that even the wind carried whispers of an ending. In London, Churchill stood at the window of 10 Downing Street, gazing toward a city both wounded and unconquered. The air smelled of coal and rain, the streets alive with the murmurs of peace beginning to imagine itself. He had become thinner, his hair more grey than white, his voice roughened by years of war councils and midnight speeches. Yet in his eyes burned the same unyielding flame. The belief that history was not something one watched, but something one bore upon the shoulders until it carved the soul itself. News of the Allied advance toward the Rhine arrived daily. Montgomery had regained his confidence, commanding with precision and restraint. Eisenhower's steady hand had turned an alliance of temperaments into a single purpose. Churchill saw in them not rivals now, but two mirrors of his own divided spirit. The planner and the dreamer, the man of method and the man of faith. Between them lay all that was best in the English-speaking world, courage joined to conscience. He often thought back to that long summer in Normandy, to the quarrels, the letters, the sleepless nights. It seemed now like a fevered trial through which unity had been tempered rather than broken. Monty's defiance, Ike's patience, his own weary diplomacy, all of it had been necessary, like the grinding of steel against stone. The war had demanded more than blood. It had demanded humility from those least inclined to offer it. One evening, after a long cabinet session, Churchill retired to his study and poured himself a small glass of whiskey. The radio played softly, the BBC announcing fresh victories in the Low Countries. He listened, but his mind drifted. He thought of the first days of the invasion, of young soldiers clinging to the surf at dawn, of generals arguing over maps while men died in fields, whose names would soon vanish from the newsreels. He had seen enough of war to know that no triumph came without ghosts. He opened his diary and began to write, not for posterity, but for the silence that lived behind every cheer. "When this is over," he wrote, "they will remember our victories, but not the arguments that birthed them. They will praise the unity of our cause, forgetting how fragile it truly was. Yet perhaps that is as it should be. History, like a kindly editor, smooths out the roughness of truth." He set down the pen, rose, and looked again through the window. The street lamps flickered in the drizzle. Somewhere far away, a train whistled, the sound of distance shrinking, of a world slowly mending its broken circuits. "We have won the war," he murmured, "but now we must win the peace, against time, against fatigue, against ourselves." A knock at the door broke his reverie. It was his secretary with a telegram from Eisenhower. The message was brief. "Thank you for your faith through the storms. We could not have done it otherwise. Ike." Churchill smiled, the deep lines of his face softening. "Ah, my dear General," he whispered. It was never faith in men alone, but in the stubborn miracle of cooperation. He folded the telegram and placed it in his journal, where it would rest beside notes to Montgomery and Roosevelt, pieces of a mosaic that only he understood completely. Then, for the first time in years, Winston Churchill allowed himself to exhale without fear. The war was not yet done, but its verdict had already been written, not in headlines or in parades, but in the fragile, luminous endurance of men who had disagreed fiercely, yet never ceased to march toward the same dawn. Outside, London's bells began to toll for evening service. Their sound drifted through the rain, solemn and full of grace. Churchill lifted his glass toward the sound and said quietly, "To Ike, to Monty, to the men who carried our quarrels into victory, may history be kind, for they fought not only the enemy, but themselves." And as the bells faded into silence, he felt for one fleeting moment the weight of the century lift from his shoulders. If this story has moved you, if the echoes of courage and frailty have found a home in your thoughts, do like, share, and subscribe. Let history breathe again through those who still remember.